On a quiet October night in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, the life of 45-year-old Ron Mercer was violently cut short in the comfort of his own home. Found brutally stabbed and left to die in the upscale living room of his suburban mansion, his murder sent shockwaves through not just the tight-knit community, but also the family that had once been the picture of success and stability. In Ron Mertz's wife, Leah, a 42-year-old dance instructor and social media sensation, told authorities she was teaching a late-night class when the crime occurred. But as the investigation unfolded, dark secrets and shocking revelations began to surface. Secrets that would unravel everything the Mertz family thought they knew about themselves. What really happened that night? Who was behind Ron's brutal death? And why? Join us as we uncover the truth behind this tragic and chilling murder, the grieving widow. But as detectives dug deeper, the layers of her carefully constructed life began to unravel. Beneath the surface of her glamorous lifestyle, a darker truth emerged. One of affairs with younger men. Beneath the surface of her glamorous lifestyle, a darker truth emerged. One of affairs with younger men, financial manipulation, and a tangled web of deceit. What began as a tragic murder investigation soon revealed a dangerous affair, a volatile love triangle. No, a love quadrangle that would lead investigators down a shocking and unexpected path. It was a late October evening in 2019 when a 911 call shattered the quiet of Westfield Estates, a peaceful suburban neighborhood in Dallas. Police were dispatched to a two-story brick home on Whispering Oaks Lane, where the lifeless body of 45-year-old Ron Miarsa, a prominent local real estate developer, had been found stabbed to death in his living room. Blood pooled around him, and the brutality of the crime stood in stark contrast to the neatness of the rest of the house. Detective Grace Hall was called to the scene shortly after the body was discovered. She had seen her fair share of brutal crime scenes, but this one struck her as different. There was something eerie about the way the house was arranged, the meticulousness with which everything had been staged, except for the violence that had shattered the calm. Leah Mayarsa, Ron's wife, was not at the scene when police arrived. She had been teaching a dance class, or so she claimed. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Leah's alibi and her carefully curated life was beginning to crack. Leah Mayarsa was a well-known figure in the community. As a successful dance instructor, she had built a loyal following through both her classes and her influential social media presence. Tall, slender, with striking features and a magnetic personality. Leah was adored by her students and admired for her beauty and confidence. But beneath the facade of her polished life, something darker was beginning to emerge. Detective Hall took in the scene carefully, noting that there were no immediate signs of forced entry. The absence of a broken window or a forced door suggested that the assailant had either been let in or had access to the house. This revelation sent a chill through Hall, who could be close enough to Ron Mercer to bypass security without raising suspicion. The brutality of the murder spoke volumes. This was no random act. This had been personal. But why? Who had a reason to want Ron dead? Detective Hall's mind raced with possibilities. Leah Miers returned home later that evening, having been contacted by the police. Her demeanor was calm, perhaps too calm, Hall observed. The grief that one might expect from a widow and shock was notably absent. When Leah explained she had been teaching a late-night dance class at the time of her husband's death, her words were measured, almost rehearsed. She seemed genuinely shocked by the news of Ron's death, but there was something about her composure that didn't sit right with Detective Hall. It wasn't just the lack of visible grief. It was the way she carried herself, the coolness in her eyes, the absence of frantic emotion. Something felt off. grief, or guilt. Manifest in many forms, Hall reminded herself, but Leia's reaction seemed oddly measured. The forensics team worked methodically, cataloging every detail of the crime scene. Blood's spatter analysis revealed that Monsieur Ron had been attacked while sitting on the couch. Defensive wounds on his hands indicated that he had fought back, but he had ultimately been overpowered by his opponent. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, had been left at the scene, partially cleaned but still bearing traces of Imran's blood. Hall's instincts told her that this was not a random murder. There were no signs of robbery, no items had been taken, and the crime scene lacked the hallmarks of a burglary gone wrong. As she looked at Lila's standing silently by the front door, a thought crossed her mind. Could this murder have been the result of something far more personal? The next morning, the investigation moved quickly. The detectives began by reviewing the victim's background. Imran Mayarsa had been a successful real estate developer, well-liked by his colleagues and known for his generosity. The kind of man to have enemies, at least not that anyone knew of. Interviews with his business associates painted a picture of a man dedicated to his work and his family, though some hinted at recent tensions in his personal life. As detectives continued to dig into Imran's personal life, they learned that despite their outward appearance as a power couple, his marriage to Leia was far from perfect. Close friends and family revealed that in recent months, Iran had become increasingly suspicious of Lila. Lee's social media presence became a focus of the investigation. With over 50,000 followers on Instagram, she had built a career as a dance instructor and influencer, posting glamorous photos of herself at events, traveling, and teaching classes. But detectives noticed something strange. Despite her vibrant online persona, Imran was rarely, if ever, mentioned in her posts. It was as if her online life existed in a separate world from her marriage. Interviews with Lila's friends revealed more troubling details. While most described her as charming and confident, a few close confidants hinted at marital problems. One friend, who asked to remain anonymous, mentioned that Lila had grown increasingly distant from her husband over the past year. She was different, the friend recalled, more focused on herself and her career than on her family. I think Imran noticed, too. The detectives also learned of recent financial tensions within the marriage. Imran had recently transferred large sums of money from their joint account to a private account. Could Imran, have uncovered a secret that Lila was desperate to keep hidden? As the investigation progressed, the detectives began to explore the possibility that Lila was involved in her husband's murder. Her calm demeanor, the distance in their marriage, and the financial irregularities all suggested a motive, but without concrete evidence. Then came the first big break. A tip from one of Lila's students revealed that she had been seen on several occasions with a younger man, Amir Khan, a 28-year-old personal trainer who had met Leila at the gym where she worked out. The detectives quickly brought him in for questioning. "I loved her," he said, "but I had nothing to do with what happened to Imran." This revelation opened the floodgates. The detectives soon uncovered more evidence pointing to not one, but several affairs. Leah had been involved with at least 2 other younger men. Omar Hussein, a 26-year-old videographer who had worked with her on her social media content, and Zed Rahman, a 24-year-old aspiring musician who had fallen in love with her after attending one of her dance workshops. Each of these men had a different story, but they all painted a similar picture. Lila was charismatic, beautiful, and manipulative. She had told each of them that her marriage was falling apart and that she was planning to leave him wrong. But as the detectives interviewed each of them none of them seemed to have a clear motive for murder. Was one of them driven by jealousy? Or was Lila somehow orchestrating the whole thing? Despite this, The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that one of these men, or perhaps all of them, had played a role in the crime. Amir Khan, the 28-year-old personal trainer, had been Leia's lover for nearly a year. He described their relationship as passionate and intense, but also tumultuous. From the moment they met, he described her as magnetic, someone who could draw people in with her charm and beauty. But despite his feelings for her, Amir insisted that he had no reason to hurt him wrong. "I didn't even know him." Amir said Lila told me they had already broken up. Omar Hussein, the 26-year-old videographer, had a different story. He had met Lila when she hired him to create videos for her dance classes and social media. Omar, like Amir, claimed that he had nothing to do with Imran's death. He said that he had been working on a video project the night of the murder and had an alibi to prove it. Night of the murder, and had an alibi to prove it. But it was Zed Ramon, the youngest of the three, who raised the most suspicion. Zed, 24, was an aspiring musician who had attended one of Leia's dance workshops and quickly fell in love with her. Unlike Amir and Omar, Zed had never had a serious relationship with Leia. He described their relationship as casual, but it was clear to the detectives that Zed had developed an obsession with her. "I would have done anything for her," Zed admitted during questioning. "She has this way of making you feel like you are the only person in the world, despite Zed's obvious infatuation." He insisted that he had no motive to kill him wrong. "I never even met the guy," he said. But the detectives could not ignore the fact that Zed's obsession with Lila had reached dangerous levels text. Messages recovered from his phone revealed that he had been texting her. Text messages recovered from his phone revealed that he had sent her dozens of messages in the weeks leading up to the murder, many of them begging her to leave her husband and be with him. "I can't protect you." One message read, "I'll do anything for you." As the detectives pieced together the relationships between Lila and the three men, they began to see a pattern. Lila had played them all off against each other. She had told each of them that her marriage was over, that Imran was controlling and abusive, and that she wanted to start a new life with them. But in reality, Lila had never intended to start a new life with them. In reality, Lila had never intended to leave her husband. She had used these young men to fill the emotional void in her life while maintaining the appearance of a stable marriage. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, comment with a number 1, and if not, drop a number 0. Your feedback will help me improve the video. Every day, let's continue with the case, despite the mounting evidence of Lila's affairs. The detectives still had no clear evidence linking any of the men or Lila herself to the murder. They continued to investigate, looking for any clues that might link her to the murder. One of the first major breakthroughs came when detectives obtained surveillance footage from the dance studio where Lila claimed to have been teaching on the night of the murder. The footage showed Lila leaving the studio much earlier than she had originally claimed. She had told investigators she had been teaching until 9:30 p.m. Investigators also examined Lila's phone records and discovered a series of late-night texts between her and a mirror on the night of the murder. The messages were flirtatious and suggestive, but they also hinted at tension. The messages were flirtatious and suggestive, but they also hinted at tension. In one text, Lila mentioned that Imran had become suspicious of their relationship. "He knows something's up," she wrote. At the same time, financial records showed that Lila had been withdrawing large sums of money from her and Imran's joint account in the days leading up to the murder. The withdrawals were substantial, thousands of dollars at a time, and they had been made without Imran's knowledge. Investigators began to suspect that Imran had discovered the missing money and confronted Lila about it. Then came the discovery of the threatening messages. Imran's cell phone contained a series of texts he had sent to Lila in the days before his death. The messages were angry and accusatory, suggesting that Lila had been trying to kill him. They were angry and accusatory, suggesting that Imran had discovered Lila's affairs and was planning to take action. "You think you can lie to me and get away with it?" One message read, "I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." As the detectives continued to piece together the evidence, they realized that they were dealing with a much more complex case than they had initially thought. It was clear that Layla had been leading a double life, deceiving both her husband and her lovers. But the question remained as to who had killed him, Ron. Suspicion fell on air. He had the strongest emotional connection to Layla, and his obsessive behavior suggested that he might have been capable of violence. Surveillance footage showed Amir's car parked near the Mir's home on the night of the murder. But when confronted, Amir provided a solid alibi. He had been visiting a friend that night, and his whereabouts were confirmed by phone records and witness testimony. Next, the detectives turned their attention to Omar, whose alibi began to fall apart under scrutiny. Omar had lied about his whereabouts, raising suspicions that he might have been involved in the murder. But when forensic evidence failed to link Omar to the crime scene, the detectives were once again left without a clear suspect. The investigation seemed to be at a standstill, but then came the breakthrough. The detectives had been waiting for a thorough analysis of Lila's phone. The data revealed that her phone had been near the Mirza house at the time of the murder, directly contradicting her alibi. Lila had claimed to be teaching a dance class when Imran was killed, but her phone's GPS data placed her just blocks away from the house. With this new evidence, the detectives brought Lila in for questioning. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against her, Leah began to crack. "I didn't kill him," she sobbed. "I just wanted to explain everything," as detectives pressed her for more details. Lee's story began to change. She claimed that she had gone to the house to tell Imran that she wanted a divorce, but when she arrived, they had got into a heated argument. According to LLA, things had escalated, and Imran that she wanted a divorce. But when she arrived, they had got into a heated argument. According to LLA, things had escalated, and Ron had become violent. She claimed that she had fled the house in fear for her life, and that she had no idea what happened after she left, but detectives were not convinced. Lila's story did not explain the physical evidence at the crime scene, and it did not account for the presence of the murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the Mirror house. As they continued to question her, they began to suspect that Lila knew far more about the murder than she was letting on. The final piece of the puzzle came when forensic evidence revealed a partial fingerprint on the murder weapon. The fingerprint belonged to Zedramon, the youngest of Leia's lovers. When confronted with the evidence, Zed broke down and confessed, admitting that he had gone to Mir's house on the night of the murder to confront Imran about his treatment of Lila. "I thought I was protecting her." Z said, "I didn't mean for it to go that far," according to Zed. The confrontation had quickly turned violin, and Ron had attacked him, and in the heat of the moment, Zed had grabbed Lila's hand. "I didn't mean to kill him," Zed insisted. "I just wanted to scare him." Detective Grace Hall sat in her office, reviewing the evidence. Zed Ramon's confession had been startling, but something about it felt incomplete. The partial fingerprint on the knife had placed him at the scene, but Hall's instincts told her that the young man had been manipulated throughout the investigation. Zed's confession had been emotional, but lacking in crucial details. He claimed that he had gone to the house to confront Imran, believing that Lila was in danger, but the forensic evidence contradicted this version of events. The blood spatter patterns suggested a sustained attack, not a moment of passion. Imran had been a fit man, strong for his age, and Zed was no match for him physically, especially without prior planning. Hall decided to take a closer look at Lila's phone records. She spent hours going through Lila's call history, message logs, and even her social media activity. The GPS data from Lila's phone had already placed her near the crime scene on the night of the murder, contradicting her alibi. But now Hall noticed something that hadn't been noticed before: a series of late-night calls and text messages between Lila and Zed. The tone of these messages shifted subtly, becoming more urgent. They were not romantic or affectionate, but they hinted at some kind of plan in the works. Hall reviewed these texts over and over again, her suspicions deepening. There were gaps in the timeline that suggested Zed was not the only one involved, and there was a lingering question that Paul could not shake. Why would Zed, a 24-year-old man with no history of violence, commit such a brutal murder? His obsession with Lele had clouded his judgment, that much was clear, but it did not explain the methodical nature of the crime scene, the staging, the lack of forced entry, and the deliberate use of the kitchen knife, all of which pointed to a premeditated act. It was not the spontaneous rage of a jealous lover. It was calculated. Hall called Zed in for further questioning. He was nervous, more agitated than before, and it was clear that the weight of his actions had begun to settle in. Zed stuck to his story that he had gone to the house to protect Lila, but his Hall pressed him about the messages, the missing hour from Lila's alibi, and the forensic details of the attack. Zed began to waver. His initial confidence wavered, and small inconsistencies in attack Z began to waver. His initial confidence wavered, and small inconsistencies in his story began to emerge as Hall continued to probe. Z finally broke down, his voice shaking as he confessed that it had been Lila who had convinced him that Moran was a threat. She had painted a picture of a violent, controlling husband who, according to Z, had manipulated him into believing that the only way to protect her was to take him Ron out of the picture altogether. She said he was going to kill her. Zah had sobbed, his eyes filled with regret. She said it was the only way. Zed's confession painted a much darker portrait of Lila. She had preyed on the young man's insecurities, convincing him that she was in danger and that only he could save her. But the depth of her manipulation went far beyond what Zed had initially admitted under intense questioning. He revealed that Lila had planned the murder from the beginning. Lila had orchestrated the entire event, not out of fear or self-defense, but out of a coldly calculated desire to be free of her husband and Ron. Emron's discovery of her affairs and the growing financial tension between them had pushed her to the brink. She could not afford a messy divorce, and she certainly could not risk losing her social media empire or her carefully curated public image. Paul was struck by the depth of Lila's manipulation. Not only had she deceived her husband, but she had also expertly controlled the young men who had fallen under her spell. Each of them, Amir, Omar, and Zed, had been drawn into her web of lies, believing that they were the only ones in their lives. But in reality, they were tools, disposable pieces in Lila's grand scheme to maintain control over their lives. Zed's full confession in hand. Hall had what she needed to arrest Layla, but she knew Lila wouldn't go down without a fight. The woman had carefully crafted every aspect of her public image, and she wouldn't let it unravel easily. Hall needed to build an airtight case, one that would withstand the inevitable media frenzy that was sure to follow. Paul and her team worked tirelessly to gather all the evidence they could. They combed through Lila's financial records, uncovering the extent of the missing money and her secret plans to flee. When they finally arrested Lila, it was a scene of stark contrast. The poised, glamorous woman who had once commanded attention with her beauty and charm was now in handcuffs. Her carefully curated image shattered as she was led away. Reporters and photographers swarmed the scene, eager to capture the case. But even as she was taken into custody, Lila maintained her innocence, continuing to insist that Zeddy had acted alone, that she had been the victim of his obsession, and that she had had nothing to do with her husband's murder. It was a bold defense, and Hall knew that it would form the basis of Lila's legal strategy going forward. The trial of Lila Mertza was one of the most anticipated events in recent memory. From the moment the charges were announced, the media had already dubbed it the Dallas Dance Murder, a moniker that played on Leah's profession in the bizarre love triangle or quadrangle that had led to Ron's death. The courtroom was packed with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and members of the local community, all eager to witness the downfall of a woman whose life had seemed so perfect on the surface. When the trial began, the prosecution laid out its case in meticulous detail. The prosecution portrayed Lila as the mastermind behind the crime, a woman who manipulated the men around her to achieve her goals. The prosecution called forensic experts to explain how the evidence supported their theory. The partial fingerprint on the knife belonging to Z plays to him at the scene, but it was Leah's phone records and her missing alibi that linked her to the planning of the crime. Planning the crime, the prosecution also introduced text messages and emails exchanged between Lila and Z that showed she had been orchestrating the plan for weeks. In one particularly damning message, Lila had written to Z, "We'll finally be free once this is over. I just need you to do this for me." But it wasn't just the physical evidence that worked against Lila had written to Zed. "We'll finally be free once this is over. I just need you to do this for me." But it wasn't just the physical evidence that worked against Lila. The prosecution also called several witnesses who had known her personally. One of her former dance students testified that Lila had. A friend of Ron's told the court about the threatening messages Ron's had sent to Lila in the days leading up to his death, suggesting that he had discovered her infidelity and was planning to expose her. As the trial progressed, the defense struggled to maintain a coherent narrative. Leah's defense attorney argued that Zed had acted alone, driven by his own obsession with Lila. They portrayed Zed as a troubled young man who had become infatuated with his dance instructor. According to the defense, Leah had no knowledge of Zed's intentions and was as shocked as anyone when she learned of her husband's death. Support their case. The defense called Zed to the stand. His testimony was heartbreaking. He recounted how he had fallen in love with Lila, believing that she needed him to protect her. He described the emotional manipulation he had endured. He described how Lila had convinced him that Imran was abusive and that the only way they could be together was if Imran was killed. Zed's story began to unravel. His emotions got the better of him, and it became clear that he had been acting under Lila's influence. The defense also tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct evidence linking Leah to the actual murder. They claimed that the text messages could be interpreted in several ways, and that Lila's presence near the house on the night of the murder was purely coincidental. After weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and emotional outbursts, the jury deliberated for only 2 days before returning a guilty verdict. Leah was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, and ZD was convicted of first-degree murder. Sentencing was swift. Leah received 25 years in prison, while Z was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Without the possibility of parole, the courtroom fell silent as the verdicts were read, the weight of the decision settling on everyone involved. For Lila, it was the end of her glamorous life, the end of her carefully constructed public image and the beginning of a long, solitary existence behind bars. In the months following the trial, the fallout from Imran Mir's murder continued to reverberate through the community. Lila's arrest and conviction had shocked her social media followers, many of whom had idolized her for her beauty, charm, and apparent success. Her once thriving dance business quickly collapsed, and her social media presence, once filled with vibrant dance tutorials and glamorous selfies, went dark. The life she had so carefully crafted had disintegrated, leaving nothing but a void where her influence had once been for those closest to Lila. The revelations were difficult to process. Her former students, many of whom had looked at her as a role model, were devastated. She was someone we all looked up to, once students said in a television interview. It's hard to believe that we all looked up to, once students said in a television interview. It's hard to believe the person we looked up to. The case also left deep scars on Lila's family. Her two children, now fatherless and with their mother behind bars, were placed in the care of relatives, the Mirza family name. Once associated with success and respect in the community, was now forever linked with scandal and betrayal. Imran's relatives, who had supported Lila in the early days of the investigation, had to come to terms with the reality that she had played a role in his death. Zed Rahman's conviction brought little solace to his family. His parents, who had believed that their son was simply a talented young musician with a bright future, had to confront the fact that their son had thrown his life away for a woman who had manipulated him. The weight of Zed's actions and the consequences were a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. They struggled to come to terms with how easily he had been swayed by Lila's charm, and how deeply he had fallen into her web of lies. As for Amir Khan and Omar Hussein, although they were cleared of any involvement in the murder, they could not escape the stigma of their relationship with Lila. Both men distanced themselves from the media frenzy that followed the trial, choosing to remain out of the public eye. Relationships, reputations, and the peace of mind they had once taken for granted. Detective Grace Hall, the woman responsible for unraveling the tangled web of lies, deception, and murder, reflected on the case with a mixture of pride and sadness. It had been one of the most complex cases of her career, a case that had tested her patience, instincts, and resolve. But as she looked back on the investigation, she couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. Lila had been convicted, and justice had been served, but the depths of human manipulation, obsession, and betrayal had been revealed. The Dallas dance murder, as the media had dubbed it, would live on an infamy. It would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of living a double life, of manipulating those who trust and love you, and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition and deceit. The story of Leah Mayarsa and the murder of her husband and Ron would be remembered for years to come. A stark reminder that even the most glamorous facades can be deceiving. Even the most glamorous facade can hide the darkest of secrets. And as the years passed, the once bright and vibrant world of Lila Mira faded into obscurity. Her name remembered only in the context of the crime that had brought her down behind the bars of her prison cell. Lila would have all the time in the world to reflect on the choices she had made and the lives she had destroyed in her quest to have it all. Thanks for joining us today. Make sure you like and subscribe to help our channel grow. We'd love to read your comments on the case we explored today, your comments on the case we just examined.